All right. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Archie Wright, Executive Director of the Catholic Biblical Association. It is my pleasure to welcome you to another episode of the CBA Unbound Book Review Series. Today, we have the honor of speaking with a longtime friend of mine, Dr. Crispin Fletcher-Louis, whom I met at Durham University whilst doing my PhD. And Crispin was on faculty in the Theology department. So welcome, Crispin. It is so good to have you here with us.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, great to have you, man. Crispin earned his PhD under the supervision of Christopher Rowland at Oxford University. He has taught in several UK universities, including King's College London, Durham, Nottingham, and Gloucestershire. He is the founder of Westminster Theological Center, where he served as its principal until July 2012. He is currently the director of the Vanity Research and Training Center, and Crispin is an international authority on Luke's Gospel, the Jerusalem Temple and Israel's priesthood, apocalyptic literature, the earliest beliefs about Jesus' Christology, and Paul's letter to the Philippians. Crispin's current primary research and writing project is a 4-volume book on the origins and shape of the earliest Christian beliefs about Jesus, called Jesus Monotheism, started in 2015. So welcome, Crispin. It's great to have you here. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to looking at your volume, which will be the object of our discussion today, called the Divine Heartset, Paul's Philippians Christ Hymn, Metaphysical Affections and Civic Virtues, published by Cascade Books in 2023. So this is going to be an exciting discussion. And we have 3 outstanding panelists with us today. And as I was going through their CVs, they're quite a group of scholars that we have here. So first we have Dr. Emily Gathergood. Emily earned her MA with distinction and her PhD at the University of Nottingham. She is an associate supervisor of the Westcott House at University of Cambridge, along with being a research fellow at the Center of Theology, Philosophy, and Religion at the University of Nottingham. Emily supervises dissertations on the New Testament at undergraduate, master's, and doctoral levels, as well as co-teaching a variety of courses in Biblical Greek, Introduction to the New Testament, the life and teachings of Jesus, among many other interests. Dr. Gathergood's research focus is on divine and human embodiment in early Jewish and early Christian writings, with a particular focus on conceptualizations of the body, healthcare, and disability. Her Manfred Lautenschläger award-winning book, The Midwifery of God, forthcoming with Oxford University Press, explores the intersections of divinity, maternity, and pain in the New Testament and other early Christian writings. Another very interesting book that she's been a part of that we are going to be working with later on in 2026 is she contributed a chapter in Judeophobia in the New Testament, text, context, and pedagogy, published by Erdmans, which was edited by Eric Vandeneckel and Sarah Rollins and Meredith Warren. So congratulations on that. Our second panelist is Jason Staples. Jason earned his PhD at North Carolina Chapel Hill under the supervision of Bart Ehrman, Ross Wagner, and our very own Anthea Poirier-Young. Jason is currently assistant teaching professor at North Carolina State University. He is a specialist in ancient Mediterranean religions, focusing primarily on early Judaism and Christian origins. Yay! And before joining North Carolina State University, Jason taught at a broad range of courses in the fields of religious studies and sociology at Duke, Wake Forest, UNC Chapel Hill, and Florida State University. He is the author of Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, Jews, Former Gentiles, and Israelites by Cambridge University in 2024, and The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Period Judaism, a new theory of people, exile, and Israelite identity, also by Cambridge University Press in 2021. So welcome, Jason. We look forward to your comments in the review. Our third panelist, Dr. Jennifer Strawbridge, is professor in New Testament and Early Christian Studies and director of graduate studies and GB Caird Fellow in Theology at Mansfield College at Oxford University. She is currently working on a monograph on sightlessness in the New Testament and Ancient World for Cambridge University Press, a work which sits at the intersection of three vibrant conversations in the New Testament studies: sensory studies, reception history, and disability studies and theology. Her research interests include Pauline literature, patristic reception of the New Testament, disability studies in the New Testament, sensory impairment in the New Testament, contemporary theological approaches in the New Testament, and First Peter. So welcome, Jennifer. It's great to have you here. So welcome, everyone. And for those of you out in virtual land, it's great to have you here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I'm now going to turn it over to Crispin. Crispin is going to give us a brief introduction to his volume, and then we will proceed with our panelists to give their brief reviews of the volume according to the three questions that we have given them. So Crispin, welcome. It's great to have you here, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Archie, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for the time you've given to preparing for this discussion. So we're talking about this book. It's a slightly large book, and it has a long journey, 10 years plus journey. It started out as a planned 15,000 word chapter on the Christology of the Philippians Christ Hymn, Philippians 2, 6 to 11, as part of a wider project on the origins of divine Christology, which Archie mentioned a moment ago, my Jesus monotheism project. And the original plan was to talk about Philippians 2 in terms of an Adam Christology, with some engagement with Greek and Roman beliefs surrounding divine rulers and emperors. When I was a young postgraduate, at least everyone in the English-speaking world, thought the interpretive key to this passage was a contrast between Adam and Christ. But as I studied the passage, I was forced to reckon with 4 or 5 facts. So first fact, there was, back then, 15 years ago, considerable scholarly disagreement on so many of its details. Is Christ pre-existent in verse 6? Is he truly divine in that verse and in his human life in verses 7 to 8? If a Christ-Adam comparison is the key, why is there none of the language of Genesis 1 to 3? What does harpagmos mean? Something to be grasped, something to hold on to, something to take advantage of, robbery, or what? What is the name above all names? Is there a soteriology, a theology of salvation in this version of the Christ story? Is it best classified as a hymn? Are these Paul's words, or is he quoting someone else? Those are just a few of the many questions which divide scholars. Secondly, I was confronted with the fact that although the praise of Christ follows a biographical structure like that in the Gospels, there are some major differences, especially compared with what we have in the earliest Gospels, the Synoptics. For example, in the first half of the praise in Philippians 2, none of the distinctive features of Jesus' life and ministry, as told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are present. No virgin birth, no baptism by John, no 12 disciples teaching in parables, healings, and exorcisms. Nothing even to connect Jesus to the Jewish world of Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem. He dies on a cross, but it could be anywhere, that cross, and he could just be an ordinary criminal. Third fact, although there is a scriptural quotation from Isaiah 45 in the second half, in fact, the language throughout, especially in the first half, seems to be non-scriptural. It comes rather, the more you study it, the more you do careful work on the language and its appearance in ancient texts, that language comes rather, as many commentators, but not all, have recognized, from the Gentile or pagan world of Homeric myth, for example. Fourthly, I had to contend with the realization that there is very little reason to think that in the community Paul writes to in Philippi, there are any Jewish converts. Certainly not an appreciable number, as is usually the case with his letter writing. On the evidence of Acts, the archaeology of Philippi, and Paul's letter itself, Paul seems to know that he's writing to an audience of pagan converts. And then fifthly, just as there is peculiar, difficult Greek in the Christ hymn, so too I increasingly realize studying it. There are quite a few places in this letter where Paul's language is odd and his words have not hitherto been satisfactorily explained. I think here, for example, outside the hymn, I think of, for example, the word erytheia in 117 and 2:3. Most, until now, have thought that means selfishness or selfish ambition. But on close examination, there is, I came to conclude, zero evidence that it means that, and lots of other evidence in inscriptions, for example, that word erytheia denotes a kind of civic corruption, a venal group behavior. So immersing myself in the peculiar language of the letter and the hymn and exploring connections between its language and several discrete spheres of first century life, especially as that would be known to the mixed community of Romans, Greeks, Thracians, and others in Macedonia, I came to the following main conclusions about the passage: its imaginative and literary world, and its meanings. And these, I should say, these conclusions are reflected in a distinctive and, in several places, substantially new translation that is freely available on the book's website. And I guess viewers may want to go to that website and look at the translation that I use for the hymn for the rest of this panel review. So the website is www.divineheartset.com. So main findings, main conclusions. Firstly, in Philippians 2, 6-11, Paul is certainly quoting, I think, a traditional poetic piece, probably written by someone else, and one best labeled a hymn, although this has been much contested recently. It's a praise of Christ as a divine being or as God. Most likely he quotes from that hymn again in 3:20-21. And the passages in chapters 2 and 3 need to be read together and interpreted together. Though throughout what Paul writes in this letter is, of course, tightly connected to the hymn he quotes. So, of course, all this means if the letter is written, as many of us think, as I think is probably the case, around about 53 CE, from Ephesus, probably, its Christology is remarkably early. Secondly, this hymn engages creatively with the language and themes of Hellenistic ruler cults and emperor worship, popular, by which I mean Homeric especially, beliefs about the gods' self-transformations and the gods' transformations of mortals who receive the gods. Thirdly, Platonic metaphysics and philosophy, moral philosophy especially. Fourthly, ancient ways of thinking about true love, eros, agape. Fifthly, the common culture of the pursuit of honor and glory that typified life in Greek and Roman cities. So those five themes, obviously not scriptural, not really Jewish, that though Jews in the first century were very much aware of them, but coming from the pagan world, the Greek and Roman world. Thirdly, the hymn centers, of course, on the story of Christ as one who has an eternally divine identity, I conclude. His becoming human in 2:7 is somewhat similar to the becomings, the self-transformations of Greek gods and goddesses, but is marked out as an unparalleled whole lifelong transformation ending in death that is best labelled, I think, an incarnation. And his exaltation after death is one where he's revealed to be Lord Jesus Christ. That is, in fact, the name above all names, that is clearly stated to be the name above all names, I think, in 2:11, as you'll see from my translation. Or perhaps better, that supreme name in 2:11 is actually something which approximates in English to Yahweh Kurios, Jesus Christ, a name in form that is like the multi-part compound names that were given to local manifestations of Greek and Roman gods. So Lord Jesus Christ is a divine cult name similar in form to names such as Olympian Zeus who hears, or Demeter, bearer of fruit who institutes the law. And that's a form of divine cult name which is tested thousands of times from antiquity in inscriptions and so forth. Fourthly, my fourth main conclusion, the hymn articulates a theology in which the one God of Israel's scriptures is revealed in two persons. There is the one divine person, Lord Jesus Christ, or Yahweh Jesus Christ, manifest in the discrete, individuated life of the man Jesus the Messiah. And there is God the Father. So it's a proto-Trinitarian text. Fifthly, it articulates all this within what you might label a new metaphysics. It draws on Platonic categories of being and becoming, of transcendent divine being in relation to what only seems to be in the realm of transient, epistemologically broken and mortal becoming. That is, the divine Christ reckons, in verse 6, the being in a manner equal with God, that's my translation of verse 6c, to be one manifest in or properly revealed through his incarnational becoming human. And the hymn climaxes with a transformational telos, not unlike the Platonist's goal of assimilation to God in 3:21. As Irenaeus and Athanasius would say, God became human in order that humans could be deified. The fullest possible soteriology in both a Jewish scriptural context and a Greco-Roman one. Sixthly, there is also a metaphysics and earth-affirming Christology of divine desire, of divine affections. The decisive moment in the hymn's story is the incarnation in the first half of 2:6-11. And that is expressed in terms not just of the age-old language of the gods visiting mortals, but of the gods seeking intimacy with humans out of love. Christ becoming a slave and his self-emptying play with ancient erotic tropes of the servitude or slavery of love and of love as an outpouring of oneself to the beloved. Christ's love is not erotic in the sense that he visits earth to copulate with a singular beautiful maiden or handsome man, of course. That's the way the Greek and Roman gods invariably behave in popular myth. But the hymn interprets Christ's self-gift as an act of supreme love that fulfills the highest ideals of the Greek tradition that had long debated the nature of true love. Seventhly, it partly does that by contrasting Christ's true love with the behavior of sexual predators. Christ reckoned that the God-equal mode of being to be not a harpagmos, that is, I translate, a kidnap marriage. So he contrasts his loving gift of himself with the way Zeus kidnapped Europa and Dionysus abducted Ariadne for marriage. Or in Paul's day, the Emperor Caligula, in imitation of the gods, thinking himself God equal, raped and abducted anyone that he happened to hit on. So that argument is based especially on the limited evidence that we have for the word harpagmos, which in several key texts means what I've just said it means. And eighthly, lastly, in all this, the new metaphysic revealed and celebrated in the hymn warrants a way of living in the city, a new civic ethic, or rather, a reality within which believers now live and move and have their being, a heavenly polytuma, civic constitution, as Paul calls it in 320, that is manifested in several ways. It's manifested in a Christ-shaped understanding of power relations, a Christ-shaped pursuit of divine glory, and an accompanying celebrity culture of healthy, non-toxic or corrupting human praise and honor. Empathy, Christ stepping into humanity's shoes, that we call the incarnation, is a model for Paul of an empathic thinking and feeling with others, an empathic love that seeks his readers' highest interests and aspirations. And lastly, this new reality, this new metaphysic, is manifested in a Christ-shaped proper knowing of oneself, in fulfillment of the famous Delphic maxim, know thyself. Christ in the hymn is distinguished, by comparison to anything in the Gospels, by his self-knowledge, his properly reckoning on divine being and what is fitting for God. It's fitting that divine being self-transforms in the way that he then does. The divine Christ knows himself, so too those who are in Christ and known by him in chapter 3, known by Christ's loving pursuit of them, also have a proper self-knowledge. I think that's the heart of what's going on in 3:3 to 11. That means Christ's followers, for Paul, fulfill the cardinal virtue of sophrosune, literally something like safe-mindedness or self-control, moderation, and humility. So those are the main findings of the book. Along the way, there are some more subsidiary arguments, but hopefully that gives you guys an overview of the main things I'm trying to do in the book. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Crispin. You really set out the book and the main points that you were trying to tackle in it, and I think you gave us a lot to think about. And we're now going to ask our panel, and if you look in the chat box, there are the 3 questions that we asked our panel to consider in their discussions with the book. They may or may not have gotten to all 3 of them, but our first panelist is Emily. So Emily, I'm going to hand it over to you. So welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to the association and Director Joshua Scott for this opportunity to dialogue about a major contribution in New Testament scholarship. Divine Heartset is a testament to the immense value of painstaking research without rush. Over a decade in the making, the book is a generous gift of time well invested in rigorous, systematic and independently minded exploration of this particularly challenging biblical text. Dr. Fletcher-Louis' substantial study deserves high praise for the quality and its breadth of argumentation. Every chapter rewards the reader's attention with new insights that I think bring clarity to some perennially vexing interpretive issues. But rather than attempting a comprehensive review, I'll offer a focused reflection on what I take to be one of the book's most important contributions for scholars and clergy and laity. Divine Heartset explores fundamental questions about Christ's identity, ontological questions about his being divine and becoming human, political questions about his lordship, as well as ethical questions about his dispositions. The book champions a refined development of a recent trend towards understanding the Philippians hymn's distinctive Christology in terms of Greco-Roman ruler ideals. Utilising digital libraries of ancient sources, Crispin expansively catalogues the literary and epigraphic and even numismatic evidence for the view that the hymn characterises Christ in the language of Hellenistic and Roman divine ruler traditions. Through close comparative analysis, he offers a cumulative argument that widely familiar honorifics transparently depict Christ as an alternative and a superior emperor to Nero and his deified predecessors. The case for a preponderance of clearly royal or imperial language in the post-mortem phase of Christ's story is certainly impressive. But with his typically relentless attention to textual and contextual detail, Crispin proposes several major revisions of the imperial Christology position. Among Divine Heartset's many points of robust exegetical innovation, I particularly appreciate the strength and the significance of his distinctive arguments in chapters 6 and 7 regarding Christ's repudiation of harpagmos. Against mainstream readings of this rare Greek term as conveying inappropriate grasping after or exploiting, Crispin builds a convincing case for understanding harpagmos as a verbal noun particularly concerned with the action of sexual predation. Instances of harpagmos are marshalled to establish its usage for conveying the aggressive seizing of an erotic kind, abduction of vulnerable persons for forced sexual relations, whether young men for pederasty or young women for kidnap marriage. This startling result calls for the revision of existing translations to more accurately render the term's hitherto underappreciated phallocratic connotations. Crispin himself tabled several possible renderings of Philippians 2:6 along the lines of Christ reckoned God's way of being not to be erotic abduction. On this new reading, the pre-incarnate Christ's rejection of harpagmos should be understood as his rejection of the behaviour of sexually violent so-called lovers, human or divine, who lack the cardinal virtues of right thinking, self-restraint, and justice. Crispin argues persuasively that the verse is drawing a sharp contrast between the character and conduct of the divine Christ and other ancient Mediterranean divine rulers, whose mythologies equate power with a license for sexual conquest. The principal concern then is not attributive but ethical. It's not whether the divine is powerful, but how the truly divine uses or expresses that power. In rejecting erotic abduction, Christ rejects the ancient belief that divine power is manifest in force at the service of God's own erotic desires. In his discernment of what is proper to divinity, Christ sets himself against the behaviour of the powerful and against any attempt to provide theological justification for rape culture. The hymn is praising Christ's divine lordship as morally superior to that of his rivals in the language and the story world of the Hellenistic Roman era. Crispin's insights on Christ's non-predatory persona might be pressed even further in dialogue with recent trauma studies of the gospel passion narratives, which explore the sexually abusive aspects of Roman crucifixion practice. As David Toombs, Erin Heim, and others have argued, Jesus' forced stripping and naked exposure on the cross should be acknowledged as forms of sexual abuse. Further levels of ritualized sexualized violence, such as genital beating, scourging, mutilation, or rape, may also have occurred in the Praetorium as part of the Roman repertoire of emasculating tortures. The Jewish historian Josephus describes the rage and the grim joking of Roman crucifixioners who subjected the condemned to every torture as an instrument of socio-political control. Perhaps then, The mention of Christ's humiliation and obedience, even to death on a cross in the Philippians hymn, is evoking Christ's own sexual terrorization by the state. I wonder if we have here an implicit contrast between his pre-incarnate stance against the abuse of power for sexual predation and his own pre-crucifixion sexual victimization by the forces of empire. Perhaps the Christ who differentiates himself from the powerful abusers of this world has such empathy for victims and survivors that he becomes one of them on his way to glory. Reasoning from the negative to the positive, Crispin posits a maximalist interpretation of Christ's heartset against sexual violence. The hymn's negation of violent conjugality in the phrase "uk harpagmon hegersato" may, he suggests, be taken to imply Christ's positive seeking of a different kind of loving union with humans. The point then is not simply that Christ eschews the vice of uncontrolled desire that might lead to tyrannical interactions with humanity. It is that Christ does so precisely because of his desire to be the true lover of humanity, his longing to physically and socially connect with humans in ways that are good and generative of new life. With Christ, then, divine power is employed not for self-serving sexual union, but self-giving, chaste communion with the ones he loves. Desire not for rape, but for an intimate relationship of mutual affection. How then might such an amorous Christology fit with the broader contours of Paul's theological agenda in the letter? Paul deploys the hymn pedagogically, such that its narrative of Christ's divine life of ethically ideal love offers a paradigm for discipleship, the apostles' own discipleship and the Philippians. Paul presents Christ's heartset of humility as the ground of the conduct of those who now participate in that same heartset. But instruction and inspiration are not his only stated goals. Paul speaks of his longing for the Philippians to be formed by Christ's divine identity and morality through intimate relationship with him. To have their mode of life grounded in Christ means participating in a new metaphysics, becoming persons according to a personhood now defined by Christ and his perfect love. Crispin's thoroughgoing interrogation of the hymn's philosophical register helps us to hear the instructing notes of Paul's theology of Christian being and becoming. Divine Heartset's contextualizing arguments also accumulate to a bold claim about Paul's cross-cultural communication strategy. Namely, that in his letter to non-Jewish converts in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Jewish apostle tactically tailors his message about the Jewish Messiah by engaging constructively with Greco-Roman religious, philosophical, and political traditions. For Crispin, Paul positions Christ in relation to Gentile ideals as a supreme exemplar of core Gentile virtues. So he is more intelligible to believers less culturally familiar with Jewish ways of thinking about God and salvation. Paul's ethnic empathy leads him to accommodate his rhetorical method to his foreign audience, even when this means largely disavowing his usual Jewish mode of scriptural argumentation. Having a heart set like Christ, Paul humbly self-transforms as well, becoming a Gentile to the Gentiles in his letter writing, theologizing about the Jewish Messiah in a Gentile register for the sake of the gospel of salvation of all nations. In so doing, Paul invites readers to adopt the same practice of accommodation in their own communications of Christ's divine identity to the uninitiated. Divine Heartset's key contention that the apostle to the Gentiles consciously conveys his message in a Gentile-friendly manner seeks to swing the pendulum back from previous scholarly focus on the hymn's supposed basis in Jewish Adamic or angelomorphic myths. Crispin's study of the letter's extensive engagement with Greco-Roman theology, philosophy, and political ideology highlights the often underappreciated extent of Paul's constructive cross-cultural dialogue. For Crispin, Paul thinks Jewish thoughts in Gentile ways, creatively making the Jewish God and Messiah intelligible to those with allegiance to other ancestral deities, out of his universalist convictions. Like his self-transforming Lord, the apostle humbles himself to become Gentile in his speech, in a kind of rhetorical incarnation. This speaks to a lively debate in Pauline studies. How should we evaluate Paul's conformities and contrasts? Like Crispin, many of us now take for granted that Paul's Christ faith was not a departure from, but a variant expression of Jewishness. But the extent to which Paul should be situated not only as a Jew within Judaism, but also as an ancient Mediterranean thinker remains contested. Putting the findings of Divine Heartset in conversation with the work of the emerging Paul within paganism school could be productive for further thinking about the conceptual interplay of Paul's Jewish and Greek and Roman contexts. My hunch is that Paul's Jewish Christology of desire further instantiates the way that his thinking is native to ancient Mediterranean culture. And for contemporary Christian readers, Crispin's articulation of Paul's Christology of divine desire offers valuable theological resources for addressing one of the most urgent pastoral concerns of our time, rape culture. Christ's eternal stance against erotic violence is perennially relevant for a world in which powerful people so often perpetrate sexual abuses. The news cycle constantly holds before us revelations of the sexual sins of princes and presidents and celebrities, as well as church leaders and congregants, past and present. Many of us have experienced directly or indirectly the physiological, psychological, and spiritual traumas of sexual exploitation, and then the further traumas of concealment and excuse. Throughout the history of biblical interpretation, biblical power narratives have often been weaponized against those marginalized on the basis of their religion, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability, or other non-homogenic identities. Crispin's research shows us that we have a Bible in which Christ has an opinion on power which fundamentally shapes the nature of his and our relationships with others. When biblical scholarship is addressing society's deepest problems, we're doing it right. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. You certainly gave us a lot to think about with your comments, and I'm sure Crispin too. Look forward to the discussion. Our next panelist, Jason. So I'm going to turn it over to you now and look forward to hearing what you have to say. So, Jason.
All right. So time to clear the throat. So first of all, I should note that I did not realize when I initially agreed to participate in this panel that this book is nearly 900 pages long, over 1,000 pages when you include the bibliography and the indices and you know the back matter. So that was a bit of a shock when I started to prepare for this panel, and I am afraid that I only skimmed through the excursus and a few other sections, mostly once I was already convinced of a specific argument. It's like, okay, I got this. I actually know kind of where he's going with this. So I'm going to move to the next section on a few places. And I will say my wife is now all the more adamant that I'm no longer permitted to accept invitations to anything without her expressed approval in advance. But, you know, I will say, nevertheless, this book was well worth it. So this is a terrific resource, if for no other reason than that Crispin has consistently shown his exhaustive work to a fault. In my view, anyone writing on Philippians over the next generation will need to consult this book, which really will serve as a one-stop shop for a history of scholarship, important material, parallel material outside the New Testament, and more. You could build a reading list for a PhD preliminary exam from this book alone. It's a tremendous amount of, as Emily said, slow work went into this. And I'm of the view that a lot of biblical scholarship is published too quickly and is underheated. It's undercooked. And, this book was very clearly the product of a lot of time and a lot of painstaking work. And you could see that. But I think it's critically important, if we are going to understand the New Testament, to swim in the cultural waters in which these texts were written. We must, as C.S. Lewis said when talking of literary criticism in general, he said, "You must, so far as in you lies, become an Achaean chief while reading Homer, a medieval knight while reading Malory, and an 18th century Londoner while reading Johnson. And to this I would add a Roman in the region of Macedonia when reading Philippians." And then finishing Lewis's quote, "Only thus will you be able to judge the work in the same spirit that its author writ." Now, of course, this is a difficult challenge and really ultimately impossible in fullness, but we ought to try as best we can. And in this case, that requires working through and digesting an enormous amount of cultural and linguistic material. And Crispin must have spent a staggering amount of time working through the TLG, the Thesaurus Lingua Graecae, for this book, for the various linguistic parallels and other things. Now, the payoff is being able to read these passages more from within their own cultural context than from our own, allowing us to shift our perspective closer to that of the text rather than imposing our perspective on the text, which actually in some sense is a literary example of emptying ourselves rather than rapaciously imposing ourselves on the text. It's actually an example of precisely the sort of mindset that Paul himself advises in general in a literary fashion. And I'm afraid that many of us don't do that well enough, often enough. And I think, Crispin, you did a very good job of that in general in this book. Now, I must confess that despite some very positive buzz from some other scholars that I trust about this book, which is why I decided to agree to be on this panel. I'd already heard some good things from people that I knew and trusted. It was like, I know I ought to read this, and this is going to make me read it. So I arrived still somewhat skeptical about the proposed retranslation of the Christ Hymn in Philippians 2, which to me seemed on a first glance to be a bit clunky and overwrought. And I had just finished work as a section editor for the Pauline epistles for a New Testament translation when I was first sent this book. And it was too late to incorporate its insights into that translation, and I had to move on to other things. So I took a glance at the proposed translation and, wasn't entirely persuaded, but was like, oh, okay, that's intriguing enough. I'll look at it when I get a chance. But I think Crispin has convinced me, after reading through this, I think Crispin has convinced me on the central arguments of the book about the meaning, in particular, of Philippians 2:6, which is one of the most difficult and contested verses in the New Testament. Put simply, I think he's right that hosen morphe theu huparchon should be understood not as an Adamic reference, another way of saying image and likeness as is often taken, but rather as referring to a pre-incarnate existence in the full form of highest deity. I think he's right to make that argument. In becoming a man, prior to becoming a man, Christ existed as God, not just a God, but as God, the big guy. And I think he's right to point out that if this were Adamic language, the narrative arc then no longer makes any sense. He would be going from being Adamic to becoming a human being. I also think that Crispin is right about the fundamental meaning of harpagmon, that this term refers to erotic abduction, or in the more classical meaning of the word, to rape, an activity for which the gods of the ancient Mediterranean were especially notorious. And his careful, detailed explanation in the chapters surrounding that, I think, is exemplary. And I think I'm persuaded that the language here contrasts one violent, coercive means of gaining a wife with another self-emptying method. Now, I should note here that for many years, when I've been involved in theological discussions about God's sovereignty and human free will, one of my go-tos has been some version of see, God is not a rapist. God wants a bride who wants him. That's been a point that I've made many, many, many times. And I've often used the Greek gods as a foil for this point, observing that the God of Judaism and Christianity is not like the Zeus of the Greek myths. And it turns out that all this time I was quoting Philippians 2:6 without realizing it, apparently. So that was actually really, interesting. Now, on the one hand, that does mean that I was probably especially primed to accept the arguments on this point, because they do confirm a theological presupposition about these texts that I'd already arrived at on other grounds and other passages. But I don't think that that's actually disconfirming, because my own position was based on a series of other texts, Pauline and otherwise, within the tradition that I think make more or less the same point, or at least a related point. So for example, Ephesians 5:25 strikingly parallels exactly what Crispin calls the Christ hymn's primary narrative. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself over for her so that he might sanctify her. Right? That's exactly what we're seeing in this hymn as Crispin interprets it. So that he might present the church to himself in all her glory. And that is exactly the second part of this narrative that Crispin is calling attention to in this, of the divine transformation of people, so that they become a suitable bride for Christ himself. This matches exactly what we get. Christ's method of gaining a spouse, of enacting his spouse's transition into a divinity appropriate for his divine counterpart, was to give himself over to win her, rather than snatching her to himself by force, as was the common story with the Greek gods. And I think that's rooted already in Ephesians 5:25, which, whether you think that's actually by Paul or not, it's within the same tradition. And I think this basically matches what we see here. But it's, I think, very gracefully put in how Crispin uncovers this. Now, these parallels in other books, I think, demonstrate that although Philippians tends to depend more on extra biblical, mythological source material to make its theological points, the basic theological points that Crispin uncovers, they do show up throughout Paul's other letters. I mean, in all honesty, Philippians has been sort of an afterthought for me in my own work, as I've spent a lot more time elsewhere in the Pauline corpus, every so often visiting Philippians where, it seemed suitable. But I kept finding myself nodding along with many of the theological themes that Crispin was locating firmly in Philippians, things that I had located elsewhere in Paul's letters that then gained new insight in reading through this. I did find myself also mostly persuaded by the more maximalist reading of divine desire and love in the Christ hymn that he puts together in chapter 7, though I'm completely unpersuaded by Fredrickson's reading of Kenosis here. But this chapter did open my mind to the idea that Paul and his contemporary Christ followers deliberately selected the word agape instead of eros, specifically to sidestep the baggage that term carried, especially when applied to the gods and behavior that might imitate that of the gods. Christ's agape is not the eros of the other gods, though there are some commonalities in terms of desire and such. I think there's potentially some ground here to advance productively beyond Nygren's agape and eros from the 1930s, which we've all moved past in the field, but really haven't managed to replace with something substantive. And I think there's a chance to really move forward with something more substantive growing out of this work here. Now, to this end, one quibble I do have with the language of chapter 7 is that Crispin does frequently refer to erotic desire and Christ's erotic leaning love, although he then says that Paul's language of desire sort of deliberately avoids the erotic. I would actually suggest that amorous would be a better word to describe this kind of love that Paul is talking about there, to kind of avoid the erotic. Paul is avoiding the erotic, but he is absolutely amorous. It is all about love and desire, but it's a different kind of love that he's choosing. And I will say that since I'm presently working on a book about C.S. Lewis' engagement with Scripture, I couldn't help but notice some really fascinating connections between Crispin's connection of Pauline exemplification of love as one characterized by a passionate longing, which is, he says that on page 750, in the sense of longing that Lewis himself, borrowing from Rudolf Otto and the German concept of Sehnsucht, called joy. And Lewis argues that this desirous love was central to Christian experience with God. And again, I think this is something that we see crop up over and over again within Christian theology. But this locating that here and exactly how deeply that goes in Paul's explanation, I think is really, really helpful and important. I also couldn't help but note some of the similarities between the discussion of divine passion as revealed in Christ and Abraham Joshua Heschel's concept of God's pathos in the prophets, which I think is a really good discussion partner here. In any case, I do think that this fits very comfortably at home in the first century context of a Paul within paganism, though it requires us to kind of reconfigure contemporary theological discussions where, we aren't as concerned with the behavior of other gods. It's not an apologetic point that people tend to make, but we should find ourselves more at home in the first century for this. I also have to say, I was delighted to see the discussion of ta'enai as referring to the Platonic concept of being, and Crispin's discussion of being and becoming. Now, I was a very friendly audience for that discussion. I've been persuaded for many years that the being and becoming discourse from Platonic and other philosophy is central here and several other places in the New Testament. But that you knocked that chapter out of the park, Crispin. That was, as we say here in the States, that was really excellent. And I think there's actually more support for the importance of the being and becoming philosophical discussion in early Jewish circles that we can find, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think 4Q instruction, for example, you have this phrase, the raz nihyeh, which it says is it says this is really important for understanding everything. And it's often translated the secret of the way things are, or the mystery that is to come, or the mystery of existence. It's a very controversial thing to translate. I've long thought that this was actually best understood as the mystery of being, and that 4Q instruction is actually itself engaging with Platonic ideas, but it's doing it in Hebrew. And so I think this is something that's already native to the Judaism of the first century, both in Hebrew and in Greek. And so it makes absolute sense that this is exactly the sort of thing that Paul would do. And if he's wanting to make this point to pagans, of course he's going to do it not adopting language that's familiar to them. So I think you absolutely crushed that. It was excellent. I do think also we see in the Johannine prologue a lot of the same things, the very same kinds of arguments. And in any case, the basic idea that you've got, that Christ transforms down so that humans can be transformed up, that he fully empties himself of his power, unlike the other gods who had trouble hiding their power. Christ doesn't just hide his power, he empties himself of it in order to become human so that humans can become divine. This is a critical point. So, I don't want to go too long here, but there were a host of other important linguistic connections, the taking the form of the slave. Your discussion there was excellent, and comparing that to the various emperors and so on, taking on the vestments or character of the gods and so on, and looking at some of those parallels. That was really good. I think in terms of what this passage actually means, which is a little different from how we should translate it. I mean, how we should translate these things for non-scholars, we're going to have to do some work to really get that done. And Crispin, you've taken a good shot at that. I think we need to continue to have that discussion as we move forward. But in terms of what this passage actually means, I think Crispin's basically cracked it. And I think that's a huge accomplishment in this. And I think it's right that this book highlights radical transformation as central to Paul's gospel. This was not just another philosophical message about how to gain enkrateia or self-mastery, but a declaration that humans need to be transformed and empowered by the Spirit in order to share in God's mastery. Self-mastery is the path of Adam. The mastery bestowed by Christ and mediated by the Spirit is not independent autokratia of self-mastery. It's wholly dependent on the divine source of that strength. This is, as in Crispin's words, virtue dependent on metaphysics. In Paul, we are exalted in power, but it's not our power. It's a shared exaltation. And the path to that exaltation is sharing in Christ's death. Christ himself shows that the only path to this exalted life is through death. Or again, in Crispin's words, the way up is attained via, by, and through the way down. I think this is a message that's as important for the contemporary world where rapacious violence is still so deeply rooted, just as it was in Paul's own day. And, I've only scratched the surface on what I've found helpful in this book. And this book is going to have me thinking more deeply about these passages for a good while. And for those who haven't read it and might be intimidated by the length, I will say this. Just reading chapters 3 through 8 and skipping the excursus if you're already persuaded in chapter 7 would be a great start. And you can begin there easily enough without much loss. And that really is the meat of the book to me. But you may find yourself wanting to go on further after that. And I think that's a real accomplishment. Now, there are a few things I do want to challenge before I wrap up. I think, first of all, I was curious about the claim on 303 that Jesus comes as a non-gendered anthropos. I think it's true that anthropos can refer to men and women, just like Mann does in German and man did in English until the last couple decades. But this word is grammatically masculine, and Jesus did come as a specifically male anthropos. So though, Crispin, you're right that Jesus did not come, quote, as a half-naked, ripped, and heroic on-air. He did come as a completely naked, presumably not ripped, but fully male baby. So this is nitpicking, but I do think it's important not to overstate those things. I do wish I'd seen more about kenosis in this book. I think we do need to reckon more and better with this concept. I'm completely unpersuaded by Fredrickson's proposal. I don't think it works for that. I think the natural sense of Christ emptying himself of all of his godly power and prerogatives, and again, as the opposite of kenodoxia, as you point out, and also as the opposite to the parallel of harpagmos, is, I think, the most natural reading. And, I was a little surprised you didn't take what I found to be a clearly definitive stance on that. And I'd like a little bit more here. Maybe we can do that in the discussion. And then finally, I'm not really persuaded that this material, that the Christ hymn itself, isn't by Paul himself. I know at the end of the book, you kind of go into, some speculation about where this may have come from before Paul. By the time I finish this, I'm going, I'm not persuaded that this isn't by Paul himself and that this letter wasn't just actually written as Paul's way of delivering his creation of this hymn as a gift to this church. And maybe Paul and Epaphroditus put this thing together. I don't know that we could have any evidence any other way, but the language in theology, I think you made a case strong enough that this fits well enough within the apostles' idiom in other respects, though adjusting for audience and more specifically Greek mythological and philosophical content, that I just started to wonder that whether this was the case. I do think, by the way, that the fact that Paul does adjust his language throughout the letter so much and doesn't deal with the quotations and allusions to the Greek Bible as much in this passage should give us pause when we assess the audience of other letters where he does that a lot more. If this is a letter where he's writing to an audience that he knows is almost exclusively Gentile and he handles it this way, that may suggest something about the audience of the other letters where he doesn't always handle it that way as well. And I think that's another potentially helpful insight out of this. But in any case, I think this book should be, and I think it will be, one of the cornerstones of any studies in Philippians over the next generation of scholarship, and it's worthy of close study. Congratulations to Crispin for this massive accomplishment and scholarly contribution.
All right. Thank you, Jason. That is definitely going to stir some conversation, and we look forward to that. Some really good comments. Our third panelist, Jen, we look forward to hearing from you, and I now turn it over to you for your time. Thank you for being here.
Great, thank you. And just to say, echo the others in their thanks to Crispin and Joshua and colleagues at CBA for the opportunity to respond to this demanding and generative study. And I think something that one of my friends pointed out to me, this is a volume that falls only 60,000 words short of Tolstoy's epic War and Peace. And so, but the Divine Heart, as we've heard, re-examines Philippians 2, 6 to 11, and is a work of textual detail and conceptual ambition, really. And I actually kind of really followed the structure of the 3 questions that we were given to frame this panel that I used to kind of generate questions that that I hope, alongside all of those that have already been asked, will further our conversation. So I think when thinking about the first question about the wider context of supporting a Christology of divine desire, Crispin describes Philippians 2:6-8, and I'll use his words, as presenting a startling combination of a primary mythological sounding narrative with a Platonic metaphysics, in which divine being is dynamic and self-transforming in its desire to be with and to take on human life. This, he argues, is a new metaphysic at the heart of this passage. Divine being that becomes a God whose equality is expressed not through possession, but self-giving. And the hinge of this argument is a term that's come up in all of our kind of engagement, and that is harpagmos. And I think the translation of this is perhaps one of the most bold and dynamic moves within the monograph. Crispin writes, the word harpagmos must convey some sense of aggressive taking. No other word formed of the same root lacks a sense of forceful seizure. It denotes a seizing of persons, an abduction, a seizing of somebody by force for an erotic union or for marriage. And it's against the conventional renderings of this term, something to be grasped or exploited, that Crispin proposes that uk harpagmon hageseto marks a negation. The pre-incarnate Christ rejects erotic abduction as a modus vivendi for one who is God equal, this is his words, to contrast Christ's actual behavior with that of aggressive and violent lovers. I think this retranslation drives the book's theology. Against the violent eros of Greco-Roman divinities, Christ embodies a divine love that refuses coercion. And the rhetorical pairing of uk harpagmos with alahieton kenosin, sets the act of kenosis against harpagmos. To quote Crispin again, Christ does not take persons for erotic conjugal union. Rather, he gives himself and takes the form of a slave, which subverts stories of the gods who come to earth to take sex slaves from among humankind. Such a reading exposes how the moral world of imperial religion, divine rulers who snatch what they desire, is inverted in the Philippian narrative. Christ's equality with God consists not in acquisition, but relinquishment. Divine identity is expressed as empathy and service, and here he's linking metaphysics and ethics. But the same move raises questions, for me, I think, alongside with what Jason just discussed, for those who argue about a kenotic theology of some kind. Because once harpagmos is defined through sexual ethics, kenosis becomes primarily a moral antithesis rather than an ontological event. The language of self-emptying describes divine behavior, not divine being. Crispin calls this a dynamic divine ontology, but I wondered if the dynamism is behavioral. God acts non-predatorially. So with this translation, the text may no longer underwrite later theological claims that God empties God's self of divine privilege and power and glory without ceasing to be God. It may depict only divine behavior towards creation. In other words, the outcome is a morally precise, but potentially theologically diminished kenosis, a divine refusal to dominate rather than a divine self-emptying as the ultimate expression of deity. Can a moralized kenosis still bear the book's metaphysical claims? I think a second question along these lines concerns contextual balance, and the reading of harpagmos through Greco-Roman erotic discourse with the others I found is persuasive, but it does largely displace Jewish intertexts, which receive only 2 pages in chapter 7. The Hebrew Bible's portrayal of Yahweh as a jealous yet covenantal lover, the prophetic inversion of power through compassion, could offer equally strong frameworks for divine desire. And by foregrounding Greek sexual vocabulary, the book potentially secures historical specificity at the cost of the Jewish texture of Paul's own imagination. And further, if harpagmos, as noted by Crispin, is not attested before its appearance in Philippians, and then only occurs 2 and possibly 3 times in later near contemporary Greek texts, I wondered how the Philippians would have known about the nuance of this word, which then defines an essential element of divine identity for them. For the second question on how foundational mythological language is for Paul's greater theology, I think I was curious about this question for a couple of reasons. And the first was, I wasn't sure that Crispin would argue that the Philippian text is foundational greater theology or safely extrapolated to his other letters. There are different places where the book issues notes of caution, such as the goal of a historically responsible interpretation is to make sense of the passage in its immediate literary and historical context. And no interpretation of Philippians 2:6-11, this is another quote, is now possible without careful attention to its role in Paul's argument in this letter. So this pericope is letter-specific across the monograph. And interestingly, more space is given to the overlap and influence of the canonical Gospels with Philippians 2 than other Pauline letters as a whole. Another element to this question, though, is authorship, which has been briefly touched on. Crispin's clear the passage is not Paul's own composition for this letter, but once in the letter, its significance lies in its use within it, not reconstructing its origin, which, as Crispin notes, we have no way of knowing. The premise that the pericope is a pre- or paratextual piece, I think, limits the question of extrapolation. If it is material Paul is adapting, surely it can illuminate Paul's theological imagination, but it can't, it seems, serve as the foundation for his theology if the mythological vocabulary belongs to material he himself is repurposing. Philippians 2 may define the moral rhetorical center of the letter, but not necessarily the core of Paul's thought. But if, however, the passage is Paul's own composition, and with Jason, this is the side of things I would land on, and Crispin does float this as an option on occasion, the imagery may represent Paul's own creative use of Greco-Roman myth and Jewish tradition to articulate his understanding of Christ. The synthesis of being and becoming, hiddenness and revelation would then be a product of Paul's rhetorical imagination, and the interaction with popular myth could then describe Paul's own writing rather than that of his source. Even so, the pattern of divine desire may not extend beyond this letter. A comparable Christology is not obvious in, say, a letter like 1 Thessalonians, which is another letter to a Gentile community. The cautious conclusion, therefore, seems to be that the passage is paradigmatic for Philippians, but not necessarily programmatic for Paul's overall theology. And then finally, turning to Christ as the ideal civic model, Crispin frames Philippians 2 as a charter of civic virtue and moral formation. To quote, "The divine Christ is uniquely qualified to empower those who are in him to think and act as wise and transformative agents in the city. Christ is qualified as their divine and heavenly gymnasiarch." And he continues, "The Philippians are cultured, philosophically equipped civic leaders in waiting." And this builds on the conclusion that this pericope functions as a catechetical liturgy, which defines those who live according to Christ's politeuma in heaven. I think one result of this is that, to quote Crispin again, metaphysical politeuma means that believers are oriented spiritually and psychologically to the praise and honor they receive from God. They're free, therefore, from a vainglorious attempt to win ephemeral praises from other human beings. But I wondered if the social reality of suffering and marginalization experienced by Paul's community may be idealized here, and whether the experience of suffering complicates this freedom. Paul's joy coexists with his imprisonment, and I think there's an inherent tension in this letter. Paul's own context suggests the freedom described through a focus on glory, honor, and praise doesn't abolish present danger. So I wondered, does a theology of civic virtue in Philippians need to hold this tension more clearly between spiritual empowerment and real physical vulnerability? Is the Philippian politeuma an oppositional rather than a harmonious body? I think related to this question, Crispin writes that he doesn't find many apocalyptic elements in Philippians and finds the letter, in his words, remarkably affirming of much in prevailing culture. But from an apocalyptic perspective, Philippians 2 could describe the cosmic act by which God recreates humanity in Christ, more so than a paradigm of civic virtue. Does the exalted Christ operate within the boundaries of existing civic order, or does his exaltation render civic categories obsolete? In other words, does the Christ event in Philippians 2 take place within history, or does it reconstitute history? In this book, it often reads as the former, taking place within history and current civic models that are repurposed and inverted. And so I wondered if the focus on Greco-Roman virtue softens Paul's apocalyptic sharpness. Would an apocalyptic lens then help sharpen how Christ as a civic model overturns hierarchies and founds a community marked by humility and service? And then I think my final question stems from this theme, but with a post-colonial perspective on it. Crispin argues regarding the imperial theology that he finds in Philippians 2, that whilst many in Paul's audience, this is his words, would not have appreciated the subtleties of our passage's scriptural contours, there are weighty reasons to conclude that it would have been obvious to the Philippians that it praises Christ as the true emperor. Its imperial Christology is not a hidden transcript, he continues, and this imperial language appears in both halves of the hymn, where the exaltation in 2:9-11 sets forth a hymnic celebration of Christ's position over and above the Caesars. I think a post-colonial perspective invites a question along the lines of, does this replacement of Caesar with the imperial Christ finally subvert empire or simply reinscribe it? The structure of universal subjugation that every knee should bend mimics Rome's demand for obedience, even if the referent changes. At the same time, Crispin's imperial Christ appears to be deliberately double, the true emperor standing over the Caesars, yet embodying the humility of a servant. Even so, the book privileges continuity with imperial categories more than their negation. Can an imperial Christ who stands over and above the Caesars also bear the apocalyptic discontinuity and post-colonial critique that I think this book invites? Overall, the Divine Heartset is a monumental achievement. It's a culmination, as we've heard, of at least a decade of heart-searching research. It is exhaustive in philology, meticulous in argument, and often daring in its synthesis. It situates Philippians 2 within wider context, but it always keeps in view the pastoral aim of the letter, which I think is especially clear in the translation of the text which Crispin offers. The questions I've raised, I just want to be clear, are not objections, but invitations to conversation that I look forward to continuing. And I just have to add a personal note that I really apologize that I'm losing childcare at 5, which is the end time of this. So I have to stop 15 minutes early to just go do some picking up. So, but thank you very much for the invitation to be here.
Thank you, Jan. You have certainly given Crispin some thoughts to dwell on, and as have Emily and Jason. And but we're just going to take a brief 5-minute break. It is 11:20 Eastern time right now, so we will come back at 11:25 and then have a give Crispin time to respond, and then briefly, and then open up for a broader discussion. All right, so we'll see you shortly. What time is it in the UK right now?
Almost 4:30.
Okay, so you're still 5 hours, right?
Yeah, it's basically dark.
Because we turned our clocks back 2 weeks ago. So I don't know. Did you?
We were a week before you.
Okay.
So there
I
was a
can
week
never-
when we were closer together, and then
I still don't know why we do that, but seems kind of dumb now. But
it is very dark here now in the afternoons.
Because
Yeah,
we
it's
don't
hard.
we don't want to have to change the schedules for when people do things based on time. So we then artificially change the time. It's just dumb.
I remember when I was in Durham, it like 3:30 in the afternoon, it was like dark.
Mhm.
Walking down the street to the pub and like, what the heck? And then during the summer, we'd be sitting out in the back of St. John's at 12:30 at night, and it was light out. Crazy. Anyway, should we go? Oh yeah, we're overtime. Sorry.
Yes, and I will say I will be on my. I've had to shift devices because I will be mobile as we do this. So I'll still be listening, but I'll have my camera off unless I'm speaking.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start. All right. So welcome back, everyone, to our Unbound Book Review with Crispin Fletcher-Louis and our panelists. We are now going to move into our response and discussion section. So Crispin is going to have a brief period since we are now at 11, almost 11:30 p.m. or sorry, geez, a.m. Eastern time. Feels like p.m. already, but I know you got a lot thrown at you, Crispin. A lot of really good comments and a few questions. If you can try to keep it as brief as possible, and then we'll give our respondents maybe a few minutes to, if they need to say something. If not, we'll open it up to everyone to comment. So Crispin, I'll hand it over to you right now.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for such detailed interaction. It's hugely appreciated. And thank you for all the time you've obviously had to put into it. Thank you, Jason, especially to Mrs. Staples, allowing you the leeway to give all that time. And I'm obviously particularly heartened, encouraged, and appreciative of what seems to be a consensus amongst the three of you, at least, that my argument about Harpagmos is broadly correct. And well, I have a question for you guys. I might as well get that out now, which is something that Jason touched on. How do we translate this, or more importantly, how do we, if this is what Paul really means, and as some of you have indicated, it has hermeneutical significance, it has pastoral significance for so many in the world today. It's a very live issue. This question of sexual violence. What do we do to get this translation properly reflected in the standard English translations? How do we persuade people to take on board what's come out here, and to do so not in 20 years' time, as the slow pace of translation committees tends to work, but more quickly? I'd love to know if anybody has any thoughts on that, either in our discussion or later. Why didn't I just deal very quickly with some of the easy points that arose from what people said? There were some more substantive issues, especially from Jen's contribution, which I'm not sure how much time we'll have for, but so Emily, yes, really like the idea that there's a contrast between Christ's pre-incarnate rejection of sexual violence and what happens to him at the cross. The idea being, I guess, that the audience in Philippi would assume, whether or not it was an historical fact, they might well assume that his crucifixion entailed an abuse of his sexual dignity. That's got to be right, hasn't it? Even if it didn't actually historically happen. I also think that, as you and Jason said, that there's got to be something going. I need to work on the relationship between this reading of Philippians and the Paul within paganism conversation, and I'm behind the curve on that. I've read a little bit about it, but I need to do more work. Unfortunately, I'm juggling a lot of balls at the moment. I'm currently spending most of my time in the Old Testament for my next project. I need more PhD students to help me with these things. So yes, you're right about that. A couple of you pressed me on kenosis, and you're right, Jason. I didn't nail it. I didn't say what I really think about that. I didn't get to I didn't have a section dedicated to what does that expression really mean? He emptied himself. One reason is I wasn't sure. I'm going out on a limb in so much of what I say here and the book's already very long, that I reserve that for future clarification, and also because I'm simply not sufficiently conversant in the systematic theology debates around kenosis that you mentioned, Jen, that I backed off from doing that. I'm not sure it follows from what I'm saying that my ethical understanding of harpagmos and kenosis negates the metaphysical reading. The metaphysical reading is primarily dependent upon the being and becoming polarity, linguistic polarity. And anyway, I think I'd say, Jen, that for Paul, ontology and ethics are inseparable. The believer is able to do the good, to live righteously because of who they are, because of their identity in Christ, because the divine spirit is in them. So I think Paul would tightly connect ontology and metaphysics and ethics, sorry. And so would the Platonists with whom Paul is interacting or appealing to. So I think what probably he'd say in response to your question there, Jen, is what the hymn is describing is a particular ethical behavior of self-gift, of self-emptying, of service that is predicated upon an ontology. It's only because Christ is divine, that he understands and has true divine being, that he is able to do the good. So in that sense, what I do with harpagmos and emptied himself dovetails with the metaphysical dimension of the text. But I suppose you're right in the sense that I do think that intense debates about kenosis in terms of the emptying of metaphysical attributes is probably missing the point of what Paul's trying to say with this passage. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that the systematicians using this passage to try and get at those kinds of questions is illegitimate. And I think personally, I would just love to have conversations with others to thrash out what I think is probably going on in that regard. In writing the book, I just didn't have those kind of conversation possibilities available to me. And wanted to move on to other things. I just wanted to finish it. Jason. Let me see what else I should do. Or actually, Jen, you raised the question about would the audience understand what this word means, harpagmos? given the paucity of the extant evidence for it. I mean, I think that might be partly an accident of history that it's not more widely attested, but probably also a factor. A factor is the fact that it's a vulgar word. It's a tabloid newspaper word, not a broadsheet word. It's not the kind of word you'd expect to appear in the epigraphic record, given the generally highbrow nature of the literary texts that have come down to us from antiquity. It's not that surprising the word doesn't appear, because there just aren't that many discussions in the classical corpus of the phenomenon of abduction marriage. We have lots of evidence for it, but not many discussions of it. And then of the 4 or 5 instances that are not in the Church Fathers, it's significant, I think, that 2 of them are in astrological texts. So Vitius Valens in the 2nd century, and then another guy in the 5th century who I discuss at one point uses the word in an astrological treatise. And I think that tells us the kind of register, the kind of the level of society, or the kind of person, or the kind of discourse where this word would come up. So it's not surprising that it's not more widely tested, because we don't have many astrological texts, we don't have many tabloid texts. But I think they would see pictures of Europa being abducted for marriage, as you have them in Pompeii. That kind of picture would be in public places, private spaces in Philippi, and people would discuss those pictures, and they would refer to them as a harpagmos. There's plenty of evidence for this phenomenon in the visual record, which is how Dionysus, how it occurs in one of the texts. So that's that. You mentioned Jane, you mentioned the contextual balance, my emphasis on the Greco-Roman rather than the Jewish or the scriptural. So yes, I mean, it is true that in my book I am really pressing quite hard on this point, this painful conclusion that I came to over several years, that this letter can only really be understood if you immerse yourself in everything from Homer onwards, and Sappho, and the philosophers, and the epigraphic record, and you need to know a bit about the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, but more than in any other Pauline text, you really need to be fully immersed in that Greco-Roman world. And so Paul doesn't need his audience to know the prophets, Jeremiah, Hosea, Ezekiel, and their use of the marriage imagery for Yahweh's relationship with his people, for the language to be understood. Though I do say, don't I, at one point, that I think in 1:8, when he uses the language of desire, epipotheo, he almost certainly, I think, has, as one or two scholars have suggested, he does have in mind at that point Deuteronomy 32:11, from a passage which is one of his favorite passages. Did his audience know that he was alluding to Deuteronomy 32:11 in that verse? Probably not. But I think that's where he's coming from at that point. So it is partly Jewish. And in one of my next book projects, I'm going to argue that the Christ hymn is heavily indebted to John's Gospel. Paul is writing from Ephesus in 53, and he knows something like our John's Gospel, and so he's reliant on the heavy role, the prominent role that the image of divine marriage plays in the fourth Gospel, where of course it's more clearly tied to Israel's scriptures. I think I want to comment, maybe just one more thing before I stop. One more comment on something Jason said. So Jason, yes, there's been a lot of discussion recently, hasn't there, about the possibility that in Romans, Paul is writing to a Gentile audience, not a Jewish one. Well, I suggest that my argument for the way we should read Philippians means that it's now a benchmark. for what kind of rhetorical strategies Paul uses when he definitely is speaking to Gentiles. And I think that the Philippians letter then calls into question any reading of the other letters, as also Paul primarily thinking of a Gentile audience, because in those other letters, he's so much more indebted to scriptural arguments, and there's far less of this philosophical Homeric stuff that you have so strongly in Philippians. So that's probably, I think that's where you were going in one of your points, isn't it, Jason? So I'd endorse that. Maybe there were many things that each of you said which I really appreciated and which I will take on board in my future reflection and work and thinking. I'm often asked, why don't you, Crispin, write a 150,000 word version of your argument? Well, I want to get to that, but I've been waiting for this kind of discussion. I've been waiting for feedback to figure out where I need to refine it and where I might need to modify here and there. So it's really appreciated, everything you've done for me today. Maybe at some point, depending on how we go, Chairman, I would like to come back to some of the substantive points that Jen throws at me, but shall I pause there?
Yeah, I think that'd be a good place to pause. Y'all can remember, you can all be in touch via email with these bigger questions that we may not get to in the discussion, but we can just if Jen or Emily or Jason want to make any kind of brief, very, very brief response to Crispin. So in case we have people in the audience that want to respond, right now we don't have anyone in the audience who has questions, so we may just give you all the rest of the time to talk. So Jen, question, comment?
I think it's just something that has been on my mind since hearing Emily and Jason both talk about the text in terms of like rape culture and the impact today. And I think part of my question, and it's not fully formed, so but I just wonder if Jesus as God could have, I mean, is the question, could Jesus as God come to rape humanity, but God doesn't do that? And therefore, does equality with God mean the potential that could have been there, but isn't? So I guess it's just that, like, is the assumption that God could have come, but decided not to, but the potentiality is still there, I think would be the question in this differentiation, but that it's not a fully formed question. And I am so sorry that I have to go in like 1 minute to jump on my bike.
I think our friend Logan Williams might be talking about this in his forthcoming book. Emily, do you remember? I know I've had this discussion with him. I mean, my answer, Jen, would be that he reveals the true nature of being, a divine being, as one which this is the way it is. There's no other way. The pagan gods are a complete fabrication, complete perversion, complete counterfeit of the true nature of God. But yeah, it's probably an important question you're posing.
Who did you mention is coming out with a book that may be talking about that?
So Logan Williams has a book on the nature of love and the gift of the self and sacrifice. It's coming out sometime next year, in which he partly engages with this stuff in the Christ Hymn in Philippians 2, I think.
And Logan's book actually deals with kenosis, I think, in a very helpful way that interacts with some of what you did in this, Crispin, if I remember correctly. And I think he might well be right with how he understands that, which may be a helpful piece. I do think, by the way, that and I know that I emailed you that to this effect, that taking especially the chapters 3 through 7 or 8 and putting them down to 150 pages, I think that's going to be necessary for the field, because I mean there's just so much there. And then just gesture back to this of like, if you wish to be contentious about this, go there. And then I think that we can do that. You did mention how are we going to get this into translations and all of that. And in all honesty, I'm kind of pessimistic about the impact of anything within a single generation. I mean, there's the old principle that scholarship advances one death at a time. And what we really have to do is, I mean, anything that we're doing is really targeting 30 or 40 years from now, realistically. And if we're playing the long game and doing the best scholarship, then that's what's going to happen. But I do think that having some sort of middle brow thing that everybody is going to be able to look at with some suggestions for translation and all of that is probably the first step. And then as people start to engage with it in scholarship, I think that that'll start to turn the ship. But we're dealing with everything is downstream from Wycliffe in the 1611 authorized version, King James version, and it's anything that doesn't say more or less just a modern version of what those do is very difficult to those are difficult waters to swim upstream on. And I think if we could start to move in this direction even 20 years from now in the revisions, that would be a huge triumph.
Yeah.
Since Jen had to go, I'd love to take up her point about the substantive point about post-colonial interactions with this, and what we do with Christ's being styled in relation to an emperor, reinscribing some of the framework of empire. I'm not sure that's avoidable if it's there. Although interpreters, we're still responsible for the ethical implications of how we handle these things, but it may be possible that this text is not easy to read through a post-colonial lens. I would invite conversation with the specialists there who are doing that important work, and to sit with the tensions that we do have there.
Yeah, that was something I was hoping to come back to Jen on, and I mean, I think she's raising an important question. I did try to address it at some points in the book, and I'm a little disappointed that she came away with the impression that I kind of oscillated between imperial and not imperial, whereas the way I think I understand it and that I try to express it is that there is an imperial dimension to the Christology, but it's not as essential or as important as many have thought. That the divine sovereignty seen in 2:9-11 is not the center of gravity theologically, as someone like Richard Borkham might argue. That the real center of gravity is the incarnational phase in the first half, where Christ's being is on display, divine being is on display in terms of love and a kind of romance almost. And that precedes sovereignty in the overall conceptual structure of the story, of the narrative. We go from divine being to manifest authority, sovereignty. But even in 2:9-11, the Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord bit is first and foremost Yahweh Kurios. It denotes the divine person, and subordinate to that, it connotes sovereignty. So I hope I'm not. I mean, I understand the fear that might be behind Jen's question at that point, but I hope that what I've written will not be judged as a reinscribing of an imperial theology and imperial understandings of power. That I'm saying quite a lot all the way through, here and there, all the way through, about the way in which sovereignty itself is being critiqued, and the focus is directed away from Christ to a certain extent onto Timothy, Epaphroditus. There's praise of those guys as much as there's praise, and well, it's different. There's worship of Christ, but there's praise of these other guys, which puts the spotlight in an important way on the ordinary believer, as a counterbalance to the hero who's up there above everyone else.
And Crispin, I would say that the reason that, you know, some may come away with that at times is, you know, one of the strengths of this book is that it really does. I mean, it felt like we were in your head for a little bit as you're working through the questions. So, I mean, and on the one hand, it's the strength of it is in you're walking through the evidence and the arguments and the debates, and it's almost like a detective mystery in certain cases where it's like, okay, well, let's go back to this clue, and this clue, you know, some have concluded this and others have concluded that, and you know, I think this clue is important, but let's put a pin in that. Now let's go and look at this clue. And then when we look at those, it turns out the first clue should be, and so there's a lot of that, which does make it a little bit more difficult to follow at times. And it was harder to pin you down in certain cases with respect to that than I would have liked in certain cases. Now, on the flip side, I mean, I think for researchers, for you know, graduate students who are reading this for exams and such in the future, I mean, you've taken them through a tour of the history of scholarship over and over again in ways that I think is really helpful. This is, though, where I think having a compendium to where you take your stances and you stick your flag in the ground and you say, okay, this is what my conclusions are. Here's what I'm going to defend. This is how I understand this. I do think that's necessary as a step. You know, maybe you can do the NT Wright thing and find somebody who is going to co-write with you, technically, you know, quote unquote, co-write with you, but is really going to reinscribe your work, you know, in summary. But, you know, I do think that that's necessary. That's going to be necessary to avoid some of those very easy places where it's not, we can maybe conclude things that were not, that you wasn't your final position. Because there are a number of places where I mean, there were a few places where you made statements in early chapters, and then in a later chapter, I'm thinking in particular of one place where he said, well, you know, Jewish literature doesn't really have angels who show up in human form in this way, you know, where you know, they appear like normal humans and it's kind of in disguise. And my thought immediately was like, well, Tobit has Raphael. And then I think it was the next chapter or two chapters later, you're talking about Raphael doing exactly that. I'm like, well, why didn't he go back and correct that? So there's a little bit of that in this book where we're following your stream of thought a little bit. That does make that a little bit more difficult. And I think that's where one of the next steps is going to be incumbent on you to take this one step further to make this easier for readers and such down the line. But showing your work in this way, I think is actually really useful.
Yeah, I found the same, Jason, but coming out of the fact that Crispin was so empathizing with his opponents and those he was engaging with, that at times he was so thinking their thoughts with them while he was critiquing them, you couldn't always untangle that. And I think that's just maybe a hazard of his deep empathic mode of doing scholarship, that at
he's
times,
too generous of a reader. As an interlocutor,
right.
he's so generous, and it was so clear.
Yeah, but I think, you know, that we can a good editor can grab that for the shorter book that we can look forward to in the future, that will be, you know, fancier necessarily with the word constraints.
Yeah, well, I feel seen, guys. I think you're both right on that point, and that's really helpful probably for anyone who's daring to have a go at reading it, to appreciate that there is that phenomenon that you so ably described, Jason, in the way that I mean, this book is written for you and me. This book is written for the specialist. This book is written hopefully to persuade colleagues to get us to the point, to get me to the point where I can then write a more popular level, mid-level book and not have to worry about arguing my points in detail because I've already taken everyone else, the key people, the scholars on the journey that I had a version of the journey which I went on myself.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience that Joshua is going to read for us.
Yes, we received a comment here in the Zoom chat. One of our contributors said, how would you relate your views, especially in chapter 6, to the contention over nuptial themes in the history of Christian theology, like St. Bernard's sermons and the Song of Songs? That is Paul's theology primarily rational or primarily erotic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I I avoided getting into all of that. I really wanted to, and I think I hope people will now pick up this book and engage with it and engage with me precisely on that question. I mean, my sense is that what I'm really trying to do, I end up doing here is creating a link between this portion of the New Testament and that strand of Christian literature and theology that has emphasized the affections over the rational, or that has tied the rational to the affections. And there's an important book actually that came out just soon after this one, by a guy called Magri on kenosis in the Fathers in Patristics, and I've had a dip into that, and it does include some of the evidence for a kind of continuity between what I'm arguing and the way the text is read, especially in the light of the Greek version of the Song of Songs, where kenosis language is used for the relationship between the lover and the beloved, which I think probably would lend some support to what I'm trying to do here. But there's a much bigger question there, isn't there? So thank you for your question. Yes, we need now to have that conversation
So if I
afresh.
may ventriloquize for you for a moment, it seems to me that again, going into this is amorous but not erotic kind of distinction or something like that, kind of might approximate where you actually do seem to land in the book, though that's not the language you use. There does seem to be some distinction. And I'm going to mute myself in a moment, and I do have to run. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm going to have to go because I have a class that has actually already started. I have them doing an in-class assignment at the moment that's about to end. But yeah, I do want to congratulate you too, also, Crispin. Again, this was an incredible amount of work that went into this.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, the eros language, whether or not it should be used to describe what Paul's doing here is an important contentious issue, and more needs to be said about that for sure.
Can I just ask one very quick thing? I know we're right at time, but you had mentioned the Christ hymn is indebted to John's Gospel. I was wondering if you could just maybe just say a little bit more about that. And
Okay, so I see 11 points of correspondence between the Christ hymn and John's Gospel.
maybe you should email me them.
I did a presentation on this recently for the Houston Christian University research seminar that Paul Sloan runs. I can send you my slide deck, Archie,
Yeah.
and that summarizes the main points, which will hopefully get properly laid out in an argument before too long.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be great. So I'm working on John's Gospel now, so I'd really
Okay.
be interested to see
There's
what.
a bit of overlap between what I'm doing there and what Michael Gorman's doing in a book that comes out next year, where he
Oh, yeah.
argues that
Yeah.
Paul is heavily indebted to John.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, it's 12 o'clock here in the East. So, well, there's only the two of you left. So I can't thank you enough. This was a really, really good conversation. A fantastic book, Crispin. Emily, great, great response to it, as did Jen and Jason, and really good comments. And I think Crispin really appreciated everything that y'all had to say to him, and will help him in perhaps producing that layperson version. And I'm sure many people will look forward to reading that when that comes out. But he's got a lot of other stuff on his plate right now. So, but thank you, Crispin. Really appreciate writing the book. I mean, it's a fantastic piece of work, and 10 years. I think I had 7 years in my Satan book, so you had me beat.
7 years of Satan.
7 years of Satan. It was rough. The Divine Heart is probably a lot better than Satan, but yeah. But Emily, thank you so much for your contribution and taking the time out to read that. Large,
It's been great. Thank you, guys. I've really appreciated this time.
yeah. And there will be many people will watch this on our YouTube channel, and so we usually end up getting like 120 people that log on to it and watch after the live version. So many people are going to see this, and we do a promotion on our social media and our website for people to go watch it, and we get quite a response to it. So
How long would it take to before you could get a recording to me? I know my wife, for example, would really like to see it as soon as possible.
you have to ask Josh that.
What's the time
Recordings
scale?
are usually up within 2 days.
Recordings are up within 2 days.
Yep. I can send you a
Okay.
link.
Thank you, my friend.
Yep.
Brilliant.
But again, thank you both. Really appreciate it. A lot of time, I'm sure, put into it, and thank you for taking the time out of your schedules.
It's a great initiative you got going here. More power to you. You know,
Yeah.
hope it thrives and grows. And
It's really, I think one of the best initiatives that we developed. I don't know when we started, but we have a lot more scheduled. We have 2 more coming up, one in January 14th with Kevin McGrudin, A New and Living Way, Christ in the Letter to the Hebrews. And then
Yeah.
February 20 and 26th, Leslie Baines, Between Interpretation and Imagination, C.S. Lewis in the Bible. And
Oh,
then
yeah.
March 26th, Michael Barber, The Bible and the Anointing of the Sick, Healing in Christ. So 3 for early 2026. We try to do one a month with a little breaks here and there, but we're just trying to promote our members and others as well. So we're going to be doing Dale Allison's new book at some point next year. I'm not sure when, but
Yeah.
April 26th, we've tentatively slated to review that book.
yeah. Emily, is your is that mother midwifery,
Midwifery.
is that out?
It's not out yet. No, we're at the editing stage, so can look forward to that late 2026.
Well, be in touch with us if you would,
Of course. Thank you.
and we'd love to take a look at it and see what we can do.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. All right. So thank you
Take
all.
care, guys.
See you at SBL?
Not
Bye.
me.
No. Okay. All right.
Thank
See you
you
soon.
both.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.